Coming up on Levin TV, we have a week full of brand new programming. We're going to do something different and very special. One chapter at a time, we're going to go through my brand new book, Unfreedom of the Press. I can't read you the whole book, so we'll touch 5 or 10% of it. But this is a crucially important matter. And we're going to address it on all my platforms here, on Levin TV, on my Fox program, Life, Liberty, and Levin, on my radio program as well. But this, to me, is a very, very important book, not because I wrote it, but because we're going to start a journey. We need to take back freedom of the press, or the press is going to die and undermine this republic. So I hope you'll join me. It all starts now. Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin. This is Levin TV on blazetv.com. Well, it's finally here. It's here. I'm holding it. I'm looking right at it. The book, Unfreedom of the Press. All of a sudden, it's controversial with the left. Have you noticed this? They haven't even read it yet. I mean, I say it's here. It actually comes out tomorrow morning. But it's here, and, well, I'll tell you why they're getting a little nervous. Let's take a look at the monitor a second. This is the Amazon bestseller list. And, look, you're not going to stay #1 on this list forever, unless, of course, it's Liberty and Tyranny. It was #1 on this list for like 2-3 months. Unfreedom of the Press is #1. Now, what's interesting about this is it's not even available yet. So these are pre-orders, your pre-orders. Now, it's going to be available midnight tonight. So I want to strongly encourage you to act quickly and get it in your hands, because we're going to spend a lot of time on it. I'm going to make our case. The media is going to attack. They've already started. They don't matter. I'm going to have fun with them, but this book isn't written for them. It's written for you. It's written for us. It's written for patriotic Americans to analyze it. And I'll tell you something rather hilarious. Brian Stelter, you would expect Brian Stelter to lead the parade. The guy walks on the walls every single day. And he's already talking about the book and what's in it and me. He hasn't read the book. He doesn't even have the book. He proves the point of the book, right? These guys don't report news. They're not interested in facts. They're not interested in information. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So there's a lot of banging of the pots and pans today because we're #1 on Amazon bestsellers. Howard Stern was #1. You, not me, you moved my book to #1. And I want to be abundantly clear about something. I'm not competing with Howard Stern. I'm not competing with Dr. Seuss. Let's go ahead and scroll down a little bit. I'm not competing with Where the Crawdads Sing. I don't even know what the hell that is. Educated. Michelle, well, maybe I'm competing with her. But you understand my point. So, see that right there? Michelle Obama and David McCullough and Howard Stern. I'm telling you the truth. If my book, Unfreedom of the Press, isn't ahead of theirs in sales, and you don't have to do anything, I'm just explaining it, by 10,000, 15,000 sales, they will not give us #1 on the New York Times list. They'll give it to Michelle Obama. They'll give it to David McCullough. They'll even give it to Howard Stern, who I'm sure is #1 from last week, because he did great sales there. So they say Levin's only #1 because of his radio show, and he's been on TV. Hasn't Howard Stern been on TV? He's been on every major TV program I can think of. Let's take a look briefly at the book. Let's start, so I can break it down for you. And this is what we're going to do the next 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 programs. As we take each chapter, I guess that's 7 programs. Let's take a look at the book. Obviously, that's the cover. Let's look at the first chapter, the cover page. So the first chapter is called, and I'll explain to you why I wrote it the way I did, News is Political and Ideological Activism. I begin this chapter asking really about a score of questions. What's news? What's journalism? What's a journalist? You know, what do you do in newsrooms? What's the purpose of news? Do you seek objectivity? Do you promote principles? What do you do? These are questions that are never asked, or certainly never answered. And, of course, the media could care less. So I delve into this into the first chapter, and quite frankly, the rest of the book exposes these issues as well. And let's go to the next chapter, just so I can give you an overview before, because we're going to go back to the first chapter for the program today. Chapter 2, the early Patriot Press, where I give a synopsis of the early Patriot Press and what flowed from there up to today. I didn't start with this chapter because I felt the first chapter, which sort of marks the position of news versus political propaganda and so forth, was very, very important to get the book started. But some of the people who've reviewed the book are very, very intrigued by Chapter 2. Chapter 3, the modern Democratic Party press. And this is where I explain that that's what we're dealing with today, a Democratic Party press. You can't argue with a straight face that the press is a Republican Party press. You can't argue with a straight face that the press is even a moderate, philosophically speaking, press. And every study and poll that's been done, survey, states that it's left of center or worse. You can't find a single one that says otherwise, not one. Chapter 4, the real threat to press freedom, and this is the heart and soul of the book. The real threat to press freedom is the mass media today. It's not the President of the United States, it's not government. It's the mass media today, because they're perverting the notion of a free press. And as I've said all week and on various television shows, and I want to underscore it here, in my mind there's a difference between the mass media today and a free press. Not because of government or anything. When you basically represent one political party, and there's really no difference between the vast majority of journalists and newsrooms in the Democrat Party, one leads the other. It's hard to know which leads which, but one leads the other. When you look at that today, and when you look at what the purpose of the media really is today, which we'll get back to in Chapter 1, which is social activism, progressivism, agenda-driven so-called press, the real threat to press freedom today is the press, because the vast majority of you don't trust the press. The vast majority of Republicans don't trust the press, and for good reason, because it's a Democratic Party press. The vast majority of right-of-center people, philosophically, and certainly we conservatives, don't trust most of the press. And it's borne out, again, by the data, but it's also borne out by our own two eyes and our own two ears. We see what we see and we hear what we hear. And there's a reason why we hear this bias, because they are. Chapter 5. News, propaganda, and pseudo-events. Well, again, what is news? Well, more and more it's propaganda. More and more it's propaganda in this country. Pseudo-events, we've talked about that. The president calls it fake news, and he's right on. These are manufactured news events, either through lies or partial information or the combination of news and opinion, where people are really pushing their opinion and dressing it up as news, like the whole Russia collusion issue. That was a massive pseudo-event or fake event, which went on for some 2.5, 3, it still goes on, quite frankly. And propaganda, we talk about that. Now keep in mind, in every chapter when I get deeply into these subjects, I give some historical context, I bring it up into modern times, and the reason I do that is perspective is important. History is important. So you know really how bad the modern mass media really are, and they are bad. And if they don't fix themselves and reform themselves and police themselves, and I don't think they will eventually perish and they'll be replaced by other forms of media and press as in the past. Next chapter. The New York Times betrays millions. Look, there's two reasons I wrote this chapter. And some people have said this is the most important chapter. Everybody said, chapter 2, chapter 4, chapter... I'm glad. I think they're all kind of, one fits into the next, one follows from the next. The New York Times is really the guide star for the media. All the journalist students want to work for the New York Times. People work in other news outlets want to work for the New York Times. They claim to print all the news that's fit to print. They've been dubbed the newspaper of record. And so they have this tremendous reputation, certainly within the news media and on the left, for a serious newspaper that pursues objective truth. It's a lie. It's not a lie because I say so. It's a lie because history says so. And so this is a very significant chapter. It might be the longest chapter in the book, where I explain in some detail, with the help of at least 3 scholars, really more, how the New York Times helped cover up the Holocaust while the Holocaust was going on. Can you imagine a newspaper doing that? Can you imagine a newspaper doing that? The same family basically runs the newspaper. People want to work for that newspaper after the fact. How does the New York Times maintain a reputation like it has today, given that one of the most horrific acts of mass inhumanity in the history of mankind was essentially covered up? Oh, they had some stories, they pushed them to the back, or they downplayed them, or they jumbled them in with other news and so forth. But They clearly were not interested in focusing on the Holocaust. I mean, think about that for a second. They go on and on and on about, oh, we separated a child from their parents at the border. We don't even know if the child belongs to the parents, and they'll write these things in hysterical tones. They don't even have the facts about a particular family. Here we're talking about millions and millions of people where they were trying to wipe out the Third Reich, all European Jewry. And in the same chapter, I point out that 10 years earlier, when Stalin was wiping out the Ukrainians, they did effectively the same thing. So that's a very, very important chapter in my view. Next chapter. This is a very important chapter too. Why did I call this The Truth About Collusion, Abuse of Power, and Character? Because our president is accused of collusion, abuse of power, and character, and a negative, immoral character. So I said, okay, let's look at this. So I look at the fact that the president didn't commit collusion, and I look briefly, you know most of it, at the so-called Russia collusion, which was a hoax, and worse. It was an attempt by the police state tactics of the upper echelons of the Obama administration to prevent Trump from being president and then to try and take him out once he became president. Abuse of power, I look at the abuses of power of past presidents. Donald Trump has not abused any power. I can't think of a single power that he's abused. And then the issue of character. When you look at John Kennedy in the Oval Office or Lyndon Johnson in the Oval Office, and they're not the only two, the way they conducted themselves, how immoral they were, how irresponsible they were, it's really what they did there in many ways is quite unbelievable. So I wanted to remind the American people of this. My editor said, I don't know if I'd put that in there. I said, no, I'm putting it in there. Now, why did I do that? Because you'll see that the media covered up for Johnson, the media covered up for Kennedy, the media covered up for left-wing presidents, mostly Democrat presidents. And Donald Trump hasn't done anything while he's been president of the United States, for sure, anything that anyone could even suggest has been immoral or unethical in the Oval Office. So this chapter provides some much-needed historical context. Then the final chapter is called the Epilogue, The Standardless Profession. We come full circle from the first chapter to the last chapter. Obviously, I can't get to everything in the book. We'll touch maybe 5–10% of it. But I want to give you a feel for what's in here and why I think this is crucially important. More importantly, why the media think this is an important book, because they're going to go nuts or they're going to play stupid, one or the other. They're not going to engage honestly. They're not going to engage honestly. But it's not written for them. As I said, it's written for you. So I ask a number of questions at the beginning of the book. What is journalism and so forth? One of the things I do is I look at a 1942, stay with me, a 1942 commission that decided, media itself, we better look at who we are and what we're doing, because otherwise we might destroy ourselves, even back then. And they took 5 years. 1942, the commission released its report in 1947. And it's a fantastic report. And among other things, they say, we have the ability to destroy ourselves or to create a healthy society. We have the ability to turn, and I'm paraphrasing, truth into lies and lies into truth. We have the ability to do all these things because back then in 1942, television was really taking off. All kinds of other things were taking off. And they were taking a look at this, and they said, now we're a mass media. It's not like before, and now communications can happen almost immediately. Well, imagine today what they'd be saying about what takes place in our country today. And so they tried to lay out some basic standards for the press to follow. And, of course, the press largely has not followed those. More recently, there was another effort to do the same thing. Let's take a look at the the board on this. The so-called standards that they were looking at. We have some bullets to show you. There's two journalists, and more than journalists, really, they're kind of academics these days, Kovacs and Rosenstiel. And they list elements of journalism that they think we should follow. Go. Number one, journalism's first obligation is to the truth. Well, that's good. Is it? Really, though? Next. Its first loyalty is to citizens. Is its really first loyalty to citizens? How so? Next. Its essence is a discipline of verification. Verify before you write or speak. The last several years, has that proven to be the case? Next. Its practitioners must maintain an independence from those they cover. As you will see in Chapter 1, there are scores of Democrats who become journalists and vice versa. There's at least 24 more, I think, that we found, people who worked in the Obama administration that had worked in the media. There are numerous family members of media individuals who work for Democrats in the government. You'll find some Republicans, but not anything close to the scale where the Democrats and the media are involved in that. And the reason is there's not a dime's worth of difference between them. And so how do you report on people and issues and parties that you feel a kinship with? That's the problem. Or the other side, how do you report on somebody like the president when you're Jim Acosta and you obviously hate his guts? You're supposed to take all those personal foibles and attitudes out of the mix so you can do exactly what Kovich and Rosenstiel suggest you should be able to do. Maintain an independence. Next. It must serve as an independent monitor of power. Now, we know that's not true. Particularly now. They're out to get Trump, and they're out to promote the Democrats. They're out to get Trump on impeachment. And we can go on and on and on. By the way, this book's not about Donald Trump, but it's kind of hard to write a book about the media and ignore what they're doing to Donald Trump. And so I don't ignore it. And he has a fairly fulsome representation in this book, as you can imagine. But it's more than that. It's deeper than that. It's about the psychology of the media. It's the history of the media. Where do they get these ideas from? How do they function? Monopolistic ideas in the newsroom as opposed to diversity of ideas in the newsroom, and so forth and so on. It must serve as an independent monitor of power. Now, this is a joke, because the mass media in this country, which I later call in the book the Democratic Party media, we need to call it what it is. The Democratic Party media, they don't serve as a monitor of power. They push big centralized government plans. They want more government. They support Medicare for all. They support open borders. They support massive spending and debt, because they don't report on the opposite. They never raise any questions. Moreover, do they ever talk about individual liberty or property rights or the Declaration? When they talk about the Constitution, they talk about it the way the Democrats talk about it, but not in its actual form and what the purpose of the Constitution is. I used to call them the Pretoria Guard media, which they really are when it comes to big, centralized, iron-fisted government. We call the administrative state, as you know, the swamp, you might call it, or judges who are appointed for life, as long as those judges give them a decision that meets their political agenda. And the media supports democracy, but only when their team wins. That is, the left and the Democrats win. Next. It must provide a forum for public criticism and compromise. Well, it doesn't. Next. It must strive to make the significant interesting and relevant. I don't even understand why this point's in there. Just give us the facts, give us the news. Try not to be political. I know that it's not a perfect science. Try to be as objective as you can. I know that's not a perfect science, but it's worth trying, because it would be totally different than what we're getting today. Next. It must keep the news comprehensive and in proportion. Well, the in proportion part's kind of funny. I don't know. 2.5 years of Russia, that doesn't seem in proportion to me. Next, its practitioners have an obligation to exercise their personal conscience. I disagree with that. I mean, their personal conscience might be as a democratic socialist. And then finally, citizens too have rights and responsibilities when it comes to news. And I agree with that. And that's the purpose of this book. To arm us with information, to arm us with facts, to arm us with ideas, to try to make sense of what's going on, the real insanity of the media today, I would argue. I would argue that we're at the lowest point of news communication in American history. And I argue that throughout the book. So I point these things out at some length, and then I go through them. And I go through not just that they lack standards, but I use others. For instance, George Mason Professor Tim Grosclose. This guy is really sharp. He was formerly of the University of California. And he wrote a brilliant book, and he said this: U.S. newsrooms are extremely one-sided. One consequence of this is what I call the first-order problem of an unbalanced newsroom. This is the simple fact that if you read a newspaper article or watch a television news clip, then almost surely it will have been written or produced by a liberal. But another consequence, which I call the second-order problem, may be worse. Two effects of the second-order problem are the minority marginalization principle. He's not talking about race or religion. He's talking about in terms of ideas, a political philosophy, or so forth. Second-order problem, minority marginalization principle, in which members of the majority group sometimes treat members of the minority group as if they don't exist. And on the occasions when they do remember that the minority group exists, they sometimes treat the members as if they are mildly evil or even subhuman. But you can see this, by the way, outside these newsrooms, too. Look at how the other media treat Fox. Look how they treat the bread and butter over there at Fox, the lineup, the opinion lineup at night, where you go from Tucker Carlson to Sean Hannity to Laura Ingraham. But they're not the only ones. Look at the Fox and Friends and so on. Look at how they're trashed by the newsrooms of the other networks and newspapers and so forth, because they don't agree with the groupthink and the pack mentality of the media, the other media. You know how we play montages that we create or others create on this program? Constitutional crisis, and you'll have 3 minutes of montages of media types and their guests saying constitutional crisis or collusion or whatever it is. It's time and again, right, that we put these montages together? Well, we can't put these montages together without the help of the news media. They say the same thing. They think the same way. And it's very, very predictable. And you'll have to take it from me. I have a quote in here. You know, right before we closed the publication of this book for editing, Laura Logan spoke on that podcast and later spoke to Sean Hannity. And, you know, I had her on Life, Liberty, and Levin, and I thought she deserved a place in this book in the first chapter, given all the guts that she showed in terms of coming forward. And there's only a handful who do. Cheryl Atkinson is another example, and a few others. But she was right on, and I want to remind you of some of what she had to say. All right, you ready? Go.
Visually, anyone who's ever been to Israel and been to the Wailing Wall has seen that the women have this tiny little spot in front of the wall to pray, and the rest of the wall is for the men. Mm-hmm. To me, that's a great representation of the American media, is that, you know, in this tiny little corner where the women pray, you've got Breitbart and Fox News and, you know, a few others. And then from there on, you have CBS, ABC, NBC, Huffington Post, Politico, whatever, right? All of them. And that's a problem for me, because even if it was reversed, if it was, you know, mostly, you know, right on the right and a little bit, that would also be a problem for me. My experience has been that the more opinions you have, the more ways that you look at everything in life. Everything in life is complicated. Everything is gray, right? Nothing is black and white. It's got nothing to do with whether I like Trump or don't like Trump, right? Or whether I believe him or don't believe in him, or identify with him, don't, whatever. I don't even want to have that conversation, because I approach that the same way I approach anything. I find that is not a popular way to work in the media today. Because although the media has always been, historically, always been left-leaning, we've abandoned our pretense, or at least the effort, to be objective today. The former executive editor of the New York Times has a book coming out, Jill Abramson, and she says we would do, I don't know, dozens of stories about Trump every single day, and every single one of them was negative. She said, we have become the anti-Trump paper of record. Well, that's not our job. That's a political position. That means we've become political activists, in a sense, and some could argue propagandists, right? And there's some merit to that. And we have few conventions, if you like, because they're not really rules, but that you need at least two first-hand sources for something, right? Those things help keep you, keep your work to a certain standard. Those standards are out the window. I mean, you read one story after another or hear it, and it's all based on one anonymous administration official, a former administration official, right? I mean, that's not journalism.
All right. And of course, she's quite right, and I'll back it up. A recent study, as I write in the book, by the nonpartisan Harvard Kennedy School Shorenstein Center on Media Politics and Public Policy suggests not, certainly with regard to the presidency of Donald Trump, that is, that modern journalism is objective. On May 18, 2017, the center issued a comprehensive analysis of news coverage of the first 100 days of the Trump administration. Now, I can't read you the whole report, and it's not in there. Let me give you a little synopsis, which is compelling. This is them, not me. Trump's attacks on the press have been aimed at what he calls the mainstream media. 6 of the 7 U.S. outlets in our study, CBS, CNN, NBC, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post, are among those he's attacked by name. And 6 portrayed Trump's first 100 days in highly unfavorable terms. Ready? CNN and NBC's coverage were the most unrelenting, CNN and NBC. And I assume that would include MSNBC. Negative stories about Trump outpaced positive ones by 13-1 on the 2 networks. Trump's coverage on CBS also exceeded 90% negative mark. So CNN, NBC, CBS, they exceeded 90% negative stories in the first 100 days. I mean, he just became president of the United States. Trump's coverage exceeded the 80% level at the New York Times, 87% negative. Washington Post, 83% negative. Wall Street Journal came in below that level, 70% negative. A difference, this is them, not me, largely attributable to the journal's more frequent and more favorable economic coverage. Fox was the only outlet where Trump's overall coverage nearly crept into positive territory. 52% of Fox's reports were with a clear tone were negative, 48% were positive. Fox's coverage was 34 percentage points less negative than the average for the other 6 outlets. Now you know why they attacked Fox. Trump's coverage during his first 100 days, listen to this report, was not merely negative in overall terms, it was unfavorable on every dimension. There was not a single major topic where Trump's coverage was more positive than negative. And I point out in here another study that's done of the Obama administration of the coverage by the news. You get almost the exact opposite. Now, these findings, particularly as they relate to Fox, are telling, aren't they? Which is why CNN turns its verbal guns on Fox, MSNBC does. You'll see reports in the New Yorker, Vanity Fair, Hollywood Reporter, New York Times, Washington Post about Fox hosts. Often they're pushing boycotts of programs or hosts and so forth and so on. It's absolutely incredible what takes place over there. Again, I cannot possibly read you the whole first paragraph, chapter. I'm very excited about this. Can you tell? There's so much in here that I want to relate to you, but you're really going to have to read it. I know that's what authors say, but I'm not kidding. But I want to bring you one more piece of this before we close today's program. And the next program, by the way, will be Chapter 2, Chapter 3. And if you find this compelling, you can read it yourselves. But let's go through it. There was a Washington Post reporter, maybe he's still there, I don't think so, by the name of Thomas Edsall. He proclaimed, and I quote, "Journalism should own its liberalism, then manage it, challenge it, and account for it. The mainstream press is liberal. Once before 1965, reporters were a mix of the working stiffs, living by ne'er-do-well college grads unfit for corporate headquarters or divinity school." Listen to this guy dripping with his sarcasm, but he's serious in this sense. "Since the civil rights and women's movements, the culture wars, and Watergate, the press corps at such institutions as the Washington Post, ABC, NBC News, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, LA Times, and Globe, etc., is composed in large part of new or creative class members of the liberal elite. Well-educated men and women who tend to favor abortion rights, women's rights, civil rights, gay rights. In the main, they find such figures as Bill O'Reilly, Glenn Beck, Sean Hannity, Pat Robertson, or Jerry Falwell beneath contempt." Now, of course, Edsall is correct about the contempt the modern press has for conservatives generally. But it is more than that. It bleeds into open hostility for conservative media institutions, and I would even put it this way, for non-progressive media institutions, even media institutions or real journalists who try to walk a straight line. Now, the media's progressive mindset, I point out, an interpretive approach to news, calling into question virtually every cultural, traditional, and institutional norm as one might expect, it now functions as an outgrowth of the broader progressive ideology and political project. The guy admits it. And when you look at this, a Gallup poll reported on April 5, 2017, 62% of U.S. adults say the media has a favorite political party, up from 50% just a few years ago, and most of those are Republicans. And of course, they're quite white. Now, for Edsel, the problem is, quote, there are very few good conservative reporters, he says. There are many intellectually impressive conservative advocates and opinion leaders, but the ideology does not seem to make for good journalists. Why don't you try a few more? That's the problem. The monopoly of ideology that goes on in newsrooms and the failure to pursue an objective truth. Those standards I read to you earlier, we agreed with some of them, disagreed with some of them, but the fact is they really don't apply, do they? Think of Jim Acosta, think of Brian Stelter, think of Andrea Mitchell. They really don't apply, do they? Think of the pages of the New York Times and the Washington Post. So Edsel then resorts to both self-serving and incoherent formulation, and this is key. A self-serving and incoherent formulation of journalism's purpose to justify liberal media bias and simultaneously reject bias as a criticism. I mean, there's a lot more here I want to get to, but let me underscore this point. They're at a crossroads right now. There is a new movement, relatively new, maybe 30 years old. It's been taught by Professor Rosen and others, and the push is, look, you're social activists, you're progressives. This is good for the country. The country needs to move in this direction, and you have a responsibility as a reporter to help move us there. And so do newsrooms. And stop hiding it. You know, thanks to us, we had a civil rights movement. Actually, it was thanks to black churches that we have a civil rights movement, but nonetheless, and they go on and pat themselves on the back for all the great things that progressivism has done. And you know, progressivism has devoured all of our institutions pretty much, right? Government, the economy, and they certainly weren't going to leave the media alone, as I also point out in the first chapter of the book. So they succeeded in conquering the media, just as they have conquered all other areas of our culture, including our education, including Hollywood and so forth. And so what he says is, hey, you know, we shouldn't hide this so much. We should pursue this. But the break is that school that says, hey, we're liberal. Let's own it. Let's explain it. Let's promote it. There's really no other way to do news. And the other school that says, yes, we're liberal, but shh, let's pretend we're not. Let's say we're objective. We're truth seekers. And this battle is now going on within the media, Well, I barely touched the first chapter, quite frankly, and we're going to jump into the second chapter in the next show, which involves a brief history of the press in this country, which I think you'll find incredibly fascinating, particularly you Levinites out there who watch this program, since we're all interested in history. And the reason I'm putting that out there is it gives a context, it gives a foundation for what freedom of the press is supposed to be. Why we have free speech and a free press in the First Amendment. Who the press belongs to. What's happened to the press along the way in these different iterations as we cycle through the history of the country with the press and so forth. And of course, anytime you criticize the press or you dare to point out their weaknesses, you're called a press hater, a press trasher. No, this book is about a fairly factual look at what's happened to the media, what's happening to the media. And more than that, as I say, it's for you to explain, we are a great republic. You know what? We have a right to a free press, a truly free press, a press that brings us information so we can decide for ourselves what direction we want to help take this country. So we can decide for ourselves whether the government is doing good things or bad things, instead of the constant propaganda, the constant fake news or pseudo-events, as the president calls them, and the unreality that's created for us every time we turn on a television and listen to a lot of radio news. It's an unreality of what their priorities are, what they tell us, how they push their agenda. And if we don't unravel this, and we don't demand better, and we don't look for other sources of news other than these propagandists and manufacturing of news, well, then we're not going to get it. We're not going to get what we need to help this free republic to survive. Anyway, we will attack Chapter 2 next time I see you. Take care.